What destroyed the Soviet Union? It's a hell of a question, and a question that does not have a simple answer. Last time I asked it, we spoke about the war in Afghanistan and how the rot from it became indicative of the state of the USSR. Now, this did trigger a few comments, and some were, really upset about it. Of course, here I'm referring to the comments from highly educated individuals, also known as Tankies, who couldn't understand why I linked Chernobyl to Afghanistan. This is probably my fault for expecting these Tankies to be capable of critical thinking and breathing at the same time, but for the people who were confused and didn't proceed to act like a pelican about it, this connection is because both the war in Afghanistan and the Chernobyl disaster together paint a picture that is the absolute state of the USSR in the 1980s. So today we will examine Chernobyl and the axis of the rot that came from it that would consume the USSR from the inside, and how it fed together with independence movements across the Union. Well, less so in the independence movements, that'll be another part, but this will be how it fed into it. And given the fact that this weekend marks the 40th anniversary of the disaster, I figure it's time to, pull my finger out and get this video brought forward and put out in time. I would like to take a moment though to thank the Ukrainian army for their permission and escort during my visit to the exclusion zone in 2024. It's an experience that I will never forget, and it has played a significant role in my understanding of the disaster from the human perspective, the individual perspective, and not just the cost that it is in dollars and cents to, the USSR, well, rubles and kopecks, but you get the idea. So, with that all said, let's look at how the Chernobyl disaster helped destroy the Soviet Union.
Третий и четвертый блок горит крыша в результате аварии взрыва.
Давай. Так уже подтвердили?
Не подтвердили, авария там произошла у них. Это диспетчер Припяти сказала. Пожарная охрана. Алло, Иванков. Значит,
Now to start with here, this is not a video explaining why the Chernobyl disaster occurred. There are 1,000,000,001 videos about that on this platform. And honestly, I couldn't really add anything to that conversation. Maybe I'll do a tongue-in-cheek style video on how stupid the chain of events were that led to quite literally man-made horrors beyond comprehension one day, but that's not my focus here. What we're focusing on here is how the disaster impacted the USSR, how it led to the collapse of the Union, and the role it played in what is arguably, by this point, a foregone conclusion for the state's destruction. But first, a little housekeeping. I'm using the term Chernobyl, not Chernobyl, and Russian spelling for a very specific reason. Namely that we are talking about a period in history within the USSR where Russian was the lingua franca that people spoke, whether or not they chose it or not. The correct spelling is Chernobyl, and as you can see it on screen now, it's got an O, not an E. But again, this is due to time periods, and because of the time periods, I'm going to be using the Soviet spelling, which is the Russian spelling, and I'm doing this for consistency's sake. If we were talking about the zone today, well, I'd be using the correct Ukrainian spelling and pronunciation. The disaster itself, though, really had two impacts. One is political, one is economic. Both are just as vital as each other when you examine it from the perspective of the destruction of the USSR. The former was like taking a sledgehammer to an already broken knee. That's the political. The latter, the economic, was like hitting that broken knee with a shotgun blast after beating it with said hammer. But what do I mean by that? Well, the entire makeup of the Soviet political system, that's something we need to understand to truly get how devastating this was. And the makeup itself was extremely bureaucratic in nature, and it worked to defend the party and by proxy the state by all means necessary. Now, in the USSR's case, you can imagine this in a way like a giant triangle that feeds into other gigantic triangles. Think of it almost like a family tree. Right at the top, you have the General Secretary, and then under him you have the Central Committee, and then layer upon layer of apparatchiks, or party men and women, until you get down to, Chernobyl. When we look at Chernobyl itself, the plant that is, We can see the extent of the mess that was the Soviet bureaucracy by just looking at the plant's structure and just how far this structure went. So, with that said, let's follow the breadcrumbs. At the top on the eve of the disaster was Gorbachev, the General Secretary. Then under him, when referring to Chernobyl particularly, we have the Minister of Media Machine Building, who led the ministry of the same name. Then under this position existed multiple different ladders of party and sections. For this video, we're focusing on the nuclear sector, particularly the energy sector, which in itself is the responsibility of the Federal Central Committee in Moscow. At the plant level, though, we are removed completely from Moscow and we're under the purview of an appointed manager. In Chernobyl's case, that is Viktor Brukhanov, who in 1971 had been given orders to build a power plant north of the town of Chernobyl near Kyiv in Soviet Ukraine by the Central Committee through layers of government. Now Brukhanov had to work within his ministry, but he also had to work with other ministries and leadership structures to get this plant working. Namely, he had to work within the Ukrainian SSR and Belarusian SSR's government, which themselves were giant pyramids working towards the premiers of their respective member states and the leaders of their union states within the wider union, which then formed part of the big pyramid that was the top-down structure of the entire USSR. If you're getting confused and not following this, you're not alone. It's a big problem. It's a mess. It's a complete mess, and if you screw it up, you can be scapegoated. For example, say if you are the leader of a town and you have an issue in that town, even if that issue is because of the actions of your oblast leader demanding something, you can be the scapegoat when he has to then report to the leader of that specific part of the USSR. Because that specific leader of the part of the USSR then has to report to somebody above him or her, and it gets worse. It gets worse every single time, and they will always punch down or punch up to try and blame whoever they can to get out of it. It's very rare that someone willingly takes the rap in the USSR because it's a cultural thing. Why would you? Now, of course, this kind of scapegoating is not unique to the USSR. I don't want that to be considered for a second. I've worked in the corporate world. I've seen it myself in the West. But the bureaucratic hell that was the USSR in this period, it's uniquely broken and one of the big reasons why the Union had less than a decade to live. If you thought we're done on that structural mess too, just remember, even inside the plant it gets worse. There are layers upon layers of managers within the plant itself, even down to the individual shifts. There are different managers for different parts of different shifts, and they don't all talk to each other. The Chernobyl disaster in itself would highlight just how ineffective this was, but it would also highlight the ability for scapegoating when something went wrong, ultimately protecting those at the top, namely the Politburo, the party, the General Secretary, and everything they represented, the state. I should add that generally speaking, these progressive deputy directors and secretaries were unelected and put into place by people in more powerful positions, quite often through nepotism. This kind of structure allowed the USSR to survive scandals caused by avoidable accidents. The goal of the Soviet state and the reason for this kind of government structure was the theory of collective states' goals. An example of this throughout Soviet history is the 5-year plans and the centralization of the state's resources for what was deemed to be the collective good. But what happens when the state can't actually provide? Well, we see that's the rub, because it starts to severely irritate people. Contrary to certain beliefs, again, we're talking about Tankies here who have no idea what they're talking about. The mid-70s and early 80s saw a marked drop in living conditions for the average Soviet citizen. Now, what do I mean by the average Soviet citizen? Well, I'm talking about the people who live outside Moscow and Leningrad in what we can also call the conscription zone. The average person in rural areas and smaller cities, not the people who live in the capital or really the secondary capital. After the removal of Khrushchev from power by the supporters of Brezhnev, the Soviet economy after a few years saw the beginning of a lag when it came to growth and flexibility. At the same time, this period saw the birth of a gerontocracy. That's when you have old people leading the government, specifically older and older people, and there's not an influx of younger people. This occurred within the Soviet Union during this period, and it got worse. To give you an idea, in many cities and towns by the mid-1980s, outside of Moscow and Leningrad, and the further from Europe you got, and specifically Western Europe, this little sliver between these two cities, the worse it got, cheese and meat became more and more luxurious for the average Soviet citizen. Pripyat, though, was considered the best place to live. It genuinely was the ultimate worker's paradise, powered by the modern atom. But keep in mind, even within this paradise of a city, there were still severe issues when it came to supply and demand. If you read anecdotal accounts of people who evacuated from Chernobyl at the time, including those of the firefighters who had full-time employment, they still talk about going to their parents to collect subsistence farming potatoes from local plots made by individual family members. It's not uncommon. This is a genuine issue in the USSR at this point. The state cannot provide the people all they need. Of course, this wasn't a continual problem throughout the USSR's entire history. In fact, there is argument to be made in the 60s that Soviet citizens were having a higher caloric intake than their United States counterparts, in certain cases. However, at this point in history, things were getting worse. And of course, this is all happening within the backdrop of Brezhnev's much more violent reaction to anti-communist uprisings. To put this in perspective, Brekhanov got his marching orders to build Chernobyl just 3 years after Brezhnev crushed the Czechs with his tanks. Just 3 years. Chernobyl existed as an attempt to overcome this economic depression that was rapidly approaching the USSR, alongside other infrastructure projects. Basically, build it to get out of debt. In particular, the field of atomic energy was seen as an out to these problems. It would be able to provide cheaper alternatives to power the state. But what happens when that state is going through severe shortages? Well, you'd think construction would slow to a crawl, yes? And logically, you would be right. But what happens if you were getting orders from your boss, who was getting orders from his 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 boss to hurry up and build the thing you've been told to build? Because his boss's other department has a quota that they need to fill. Well, the answer is you cut corners to fulfill the quota. You do things like sealing the roofing with highly flammable tar. You combine reactors into the same building. You don't build containment buildings. You don't put in as many safeguards. And of course, you hide the very design flaw that can cause a catastrophe because the state cannot fail, and the state didn't actually tell you that design flaw existed in the first place, so it's really not a problem. Keep in mind, this is all going on in what is supposed to be the premier style of life in the USSR. And in the background, there's a horrific war going on in Afghanistan. Things are not great in the Soviet Union, and they're getting worse for the average person. And the news that sifts through is showing just how precarious this situation is truly becoming, and the Central Committee is aware of this. Gorbachev is aware of this, which is why he's starting to reform the state. And it's all indicative here of a slingshot being drawn back, and then, boom, the tension has reached a critical point. With this new leader in charge who has taken over and recognised the shortcomings of the state, and now is attempting to modernise it through openness and communication, allegedly, there is the perfect storm for a large disaster that can throw the Soviet state straight into the void of collapse. Because when this disaster happens, the overinflated bureaucracy that we've been talking about for the last 15 or so minutes cannot cope. And it will turn back in on old habits. All of these consequences stemming from the era of stagnation in Soviet political structure came to fruition with the disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on April 26, 1986. The destruction of the plant and the scale of the disaster was, in contrast to the promised policies of transparency, initially hidden from the public and the world, including the nearby town of Pripyat. The Soviet news headline warning of the disaster spoke of an accident that was being handled by the government.
На Чернобыльской атомной электростанции произошла авария. Поврежден один из атомных реакторов. Принимаются меры по ликвидации последствий аварии. Пострадавшим оказывается помощь. Создана правительственная комиссия.
But it was not until days later when a power plant in Sweden discovered the high levels of radiation that had travelled from the USSR and Soviet Ukraine that the USSR was finally forced to admit what happened. But even then they lied, hiding the extent of the disaster from a now completely aware Soviet public who knew they were being lied to. Make no mistake, Soviet citizens were not stupid. They knew their government was full of it. 90% of the time, they knew it. But this was so overt that even the most die-hard member of the Komsomol could not hide the fact that they were being lied to. They could not cognitively deny it. They knew they were being lied to. But dear viewer, I've also kind of lied to you so far in this video when talking about the Soviet government, because I haven't mentioned the hidden power behind the state. I've alluded to it. This was completely intentional, because, well, you aren't meant to realize they're actually there and who pulls the strings. Of course, I'm talking about the deep state, or really just the KGB. The moment this disaster happened, the KGB swung into action. It silenced the news, it controlled the flow of information, it regressed back to the old Soviet way of thinking. Even the causes for the disaster at Chernobyl were hidden, with the scientists told to lie to the world just to hide how bad it was. And it wasn't until the scientist made famous for his role in the cleanup at the Chernobyl, Valery Legasov, committed suicide, that his notes regarding the cause of the disaster were disseminated amongst the scientific community and the murmurings grew. The attempted cover-up and reaction of the Soviet state with regards to the disaster itself completely contrasted with the promised policy of change of glasnost and perestroika. Soviet citizens knew they couldn't trust their media. Granted, they already knew this, it was a well-known fact, but what this disaster did was it showed that the state, the centre of the very fibre of the Union, was weak. And right as this was occurring, the very thing that supported that state, the Red Army, remember I said in that video, the Soviet Union is a state held together by military power and the promise of that power and the aura of that power, compared to the United States, which is held together by the dollar. That power was shown to be weak. But to make matters worse, Soviet citizens were still being fed the great lie every time they turned on their fancy new TV or read an advertisement about all these amazing things that they could achieve if they just went to work and did what the state needed. Now, side tangent on the TVs here. During the late Soviet Union, the use of television had grown within major cities such as Moscow and Leningrad, and television and advertising for products had become very popular. Within the Soviet Union, all businesses were state-run enterprises. The advertisement was less at first showing people what they could buy per se from other companies, rather than what was simply available. A significant amount of this Soviet television advertisement during this period originated from the Estonian SSR, from particularly the director Harry Egypt. Egypt's advertising showed the ideal Soviet lifestyle, and it was very much based on propaganda that life in the Union was comfortable and prosperous. Pripyat itself was the ideal to strive for, and everyone kind of knew it. If you could, you would move to Pripyat, or a city like it. So when it became Dante's seventh level of hell, the economic woes experienced by the Soviet people, coupled with the evident dishonesty by the news sources, led to the situation where people started to consume advertisement for products they could never own. I'm using a broad stroke here, so let's take it down to a simple singular item, the washing machine. This was a luxury that most Soviet citizens simply could not afford. So let's take a stock of all these events occurring at once. 1. The state has shown to be weak. 2. Gorbachev has been shown to be a liar about his policy. Granted, the people don't really get entirely that he has no real control. It's the KGB. He is a member of the system. He is an apparatchik, just like everyone else. 3. The system has failed to provide and protect the people. 4. Things are getting more expensive. 5. An entire city is now being evacuated and basically scrubbed off the map. And 6. The only reason this is remotely even known is because the guy cleaning it up, the face of the fix, necked himself. Are you starting to see the impact this is having on the average person's faith in an already broken system? Now we get to the meat and potatoes, the economic fallout. And just because I can't mention Harry Egypt without including it, have a quick peek at the chicken ad. So far, I've talked about how the disaster impacted the people living in the USSR, but what about the actual tangible cost? Well, the short answer is we don't actually entirely know, because the accountants of the USSR during this period were incredible at fudging numbers to fulfill quotas and needs. But what we do know paints a severely grim picture. I'm going to try and explain how the cleanup here started, because you may need to replay this section, so, strap in, because it's about to get really confusing really quickly, and it will explain pretty clearly just how paralysed the state was for a disaster of this magnitude. The blame game for the Chernobyl disaster and the cleanup responsibility in itself is insanity. Thank you, Sohi Blocky, for putting this in words I can summarise for you all. The individual union states were nominally responsible for energy production, kind of. However, the production itself, due to it being nuclear in nature, was the responsibility of the central government in Moscow. So the energy itself is the responsibility of the Ukrainian SSR, but the production and the plant belong to the Central Soviet government. Now, when the disaster happens, the cleanup technically falls on the Ukrainian and Belarusian SSRs because it's in their territory for the area surrounding the plant. But the plant itself is the Soviet government because the nuclear construction is the central government's job, even though the energy itself is nominally kind of, but also kind of not, at the individual union state level because it needs to meet the quotas for the power grid in Kyiv and part of the Ukrainian SSR. To make this more fun, remember how I said every single political appointee has a dozen levels of management above and below? Well, they technically can't actually speak laterally from union member state to government to central committee government, so messages have to go up and down through all levels. This includes getting a message up from the Ukrainian SSR to the Central Committee, who then relay it to the Belarusian SSR. So you can see how this is a complete mess. Thankfully, the Soviets realised this was stupid considering what was going on, and they actually made a body to deal with the cleanup. This is where Boris Shabina comes in, of course. You may know him from the TV show Chernobyl, but look up the man in reality. He is a fascinating person. But that took time to set this up. It took a lot of time, and in that time the reactor was belching its poison all over Belarus, Ukraine, and Europe. As for the actual tangible financial cost, the immediate emergency response alone was staggering. The cleanup effort involved more than 500,000 personnel and cost an estimated 18 billion rubles, which as of 2026 is roughly 85 billion US dollars in today's money. The initial cleanup costs also included the construction of the now iconic concrete sarcophagus encasing the destroyed reactor. This sarcophagus, though, was a short-term plug, and it was intended to be replaced in a few decades by the USSR. Oh, wait, never mind. Well, Europe's problem in future now. Anyway, the burden on individual nations within the USSR alone on top of this was immense. In Belarus, government spending on Chernobyl amounted to 22.3% of the entire national budget. Mind you, this is in 1991 when we actually get the figures, not the Soviet figures. Total Belarusian spending between 91 and 03 alone exceeds 13 billion US dollars. Ukraine, where the disaster actually occurred, copped it even worse. Its total economic losses were estimated at nearly 180 billion in 2015, roughly equivalent of an entire year of that country's GDP at the time. Loss of energy output also compounded the damage. See, the Chernobyl plant had supplied roughly 10% of Ukraine's electricity, and when reactors 5 and 6 were finished, it was set to be one of the premier electricity plants in the USSR. Shutting it down forced workarounds and slowed industrial production across the Republic. Again, to give you an idea of the kind of scale of this disruption, in 1970, 20% of the USSR's population was in Ukraine, yet 50% of the USSR's pig iron production, 40% of the Union's steel, half of its iron ore, 1/3 of its coal and gas, all of it came from Ukraine, right alongside the majority of all diesel locomotives, sugar beet harvesting, half the metallurgical machinery, significant amounts of tractors and cars, and heavy industrial equipment. There is more, but for all intents and purposes, little Ukraine held up half of the Soviet economy. Half, while accounting for a fraction of its landmass and population. The compounding issue with Chernobyl was the vast amount of people who became burdens on the state due to medical issues. Large sums today even continue to be paid in the form of social benefits for up to 7 million people due to increased cancer rates and disease rates amongst those who copped a hefty dose of radiation in the cleanup. When you put all the figures together and account for the cost of the liquidators, the health issues, lost economic output, the destruction of the reactor, the zone, the city, the cost of the disaster balloons. Some estimates claim up to $1 trillion was cut from the Western Soviet Union in terms of value, but more conservative estimates put it roughly between 500 and 600 billion. With a B, billion. Truly, with everything that happened in 1991, we just don't really know, And to be honest, it's irrelevant if it's 50 billion, 100 billion, 500 billion, or a trillion, because either way, it was a shotgun to an already broken economy's kneecaps. Beyond the former Soviet states, economic losses were also incurred by other countries, particularly in Scandinavia, where agriculture and outside industries copped a massive hit. And naturally, these nations looked at the USSR with a less than enthusiastic feeling, and again, it was another cost, this time in political power, on the world stage. The country was a joke. It was a complete joke. Its army wasn't able to beat people in mountains in pajamas. Its energy sector was exploding. The people couldn't buy day-to-day items that they wanted. They were being left behind. What was the point of it all? The cost of Chernobyl was truly and is honestly immense. It truly is insane. Even today, there is a cost as the region has become a war zone. Russian forces make regular incursions from Belarus into Pripyat, and the surrounding area, which in itself is now covered in landmines. I'll leave you all with this just to ponder. It's an image I took of something I found in a room in one of the buildings in Pripyat used by Russian soldiers who had previously made camp in the Red Forest. You know, the ones who dug up the trenches there and camped amongst all the buried radioactive dirt and waste. It was the only modern thing in the room. A Bible, left open when they fled. I think it says everything about just how devastating the fallout from this disaster truly was and continues to be. Next time when we come back, we're going to look more at the slingshot that I've been talking about. We're going to look at how Afghanistan and Chernobyl laid bare issues within the Soviet Union to the average person, and how that compounded with rising nationalism within Soviet member states to discuss how the people, fed up from being sent to fight wars against the invisible enemy of radiation, the Afghanis, and spurned on by a state that was obviously lying to them, had had enough, and made sure that for one major time, the Politburo would hear the people sing. Thank you all for joining me this weekend to watch this video, and yes, it came out very quickly and was produced with under 48 hours, so I'm quite happy with that, even though the script was written earlier. Like, comment, subscribe. If you would like to learn more about Chernobyl, please let me know in the comment below. I don't really want to do a this is what happened in Chernobyl, because again, it's been done to death. So if you want to learn more things about the disaster, that aren't, what exactly happened to the reactor, I'd be more than happy to make it. Just let me know what you think. And yeah, I will catch you all next time.